Hi, my name is Luisa De Vuono, and today I'm going to be talking to you guys about the disease mononucleosis. I included here an image of a mononucleosis virus, and as you can see, it has little spikes, and I will explain everything you need to know about the structure and its parts later on in this presentation. Introducing mono, which is short for mononucleosis, but you guys probably know mononucleosis as the kissing disease. It is a contagious infection caused by a herpes virus called Epstein-Barr virus, EBV. This virus is spread through the saliva and it is contagious. However, when put in perspective with other viruses such as the common cold and flu, it's not as contagious since it's spreadable through the saliva and not airborne. It's a little less contagious. Next, I'm going to talk about taxonomy. So, mononucleosis starts with the order Herpes virilis, and then it goes into the family Herpes viridae, and then the subfamily Gamma herpes viruses, and the genus Lymphocriptoviruses, and finally the species human herpes viruses for EBV. This is an image of the monovirus through a microscope. So here is a shortened version of a phylogenetic tree because the order for mono herpes virilis is very in-depth and has a lot of detail. So I shortened it to start with the family Herpes viridae. And this family is known to have double-stranded linear DNA viruses. And then the subfamily gamma herpes viruses is known to have high latency rates. And then when we move on to genus, this is known to be viruses that infect humans and New World monkeys. And then going into the species, this is the species that only infects humans and also carries the mono infection. Next, I'm going to talk to you guys about the general structure, which is shown here in image A, and then in image B is shown by the genome and the latent genes. As you can see, here is the general structure of the mono virus, and it has an outer layer envelope with external virus-encoded glycoproteins, which are these, and then here's the envelope. Then it goes on to having a nucleocapsid, and here's the viral genome, and then in between the envelope and the nucleocapsid, there's a tegument, which is this little area here. Here on the right shows the direction of the latent gene transcriptions. So the arrowheads around the large ones, they show the EBNA2 and EBNA3 transcription, and then the smaller one shows the EBNA1 transcription. Next, I'm going to talk about the viral replication. So EBV is probably the most potent transforming human virus in culture, and it's known to infect and persist in life in the dormant stage in about 90% of human adults. So what does that mean? That means that once you have the virus in your body, it will not leave. It stays in your body even after your symptoms and stuff, and it stays dormant in your body, and it can come back up, arise whenever your immune system is immunocompromised or something like that. So there are two specific ways of replication, and one is the primary infection, which is when the virus is first being introduced to your body, and then there's the persistent infection, which is when you already had the virus and it's dormant in your body, and then it just resurfaces. So for the primary infection, it starts with the saliva and it goes into your epithelium cells, and that's what initiates this lytic cycle and the lytic replication. So that goes into your naive B cells and the memory cells, which then starts the replication process, which is latency 3, which is the EBNA3. These are the 3 growth program proteins. And so these 3 program proteins allows for the germinal center to begin, which is when they establish a default transcription program. So the cells just keep replicating and keep going. And then that goes into the memory B cell reservoir, and then the B cells can either go back to your tonsils and like have more infection, or it can go to your saliva, which will eventually lead to out of the host. So with the persistent infection, it's basically the same thing, but there's just not the first step where you already have this virus in your saliva, so it's not like coming into your epithelium, it's already in there. So it's just resurfacing. Okay, next there's the history of mono. So in 1880 is when Nil Filatov recognized mono as a unique disease. And then next in 1920, Sprun and Evans were the ones that first described mono. And then in 1923, Downey and McKinney came up with detailed descriptions of mono. And then in 1932, Paul and Brunel identified the heterophile antibody, which I will explain later in the presentation. And then in 1964, Anthony Epstein discovered the EBV as the first tumor virus. Okay, so now for transmission and symptoms. Mono spreads most commonly through bodily fluids, particularly through the saliva, but it can also spread through blood, semen, blood transfusions, and organ transplants. It can also be spread through the use of objects such as drinking glass, toothbrush that was recently used by someone that had mono. The virus usually survives on the objects, and as long as it's still moist, so like because it's in the saliva, so as long as it's still moist, you can still get mono from it. The first time you get infected with EBV, you can spread the virus for weeks even before you have symptoms, so that's very dangerous. But like I mentioned before, once the virus is in your body, it will stay dormant in its latent state, and if it reactivates, you will be contagious again. Usually it doesn't reactivate unless you have like an immunocompromised, I don't know, another disease or virus or something that could just compromise your immune system, so it will most likely resurface. Now for symptoms. It can take anywhere between 2 to 6 weeks to appear, and it can last up to 4 months, which is very dangerous. One of the things that you'll feel is fatigued. You can have a fever, most likely will have an inflamed throat, and it'll look something like this. It kind of looks like strep, but it's a little bit different, and the doctor can tell. You'll have some swollen lymph nodes in your neck, so these lymph nodes will be swollen. You may have an enlarged spleen, which can be very, very dangerous. Your liver may be swollen, and you may have some rashes throughout your body. So what's most important to know, though, about mono is that it affects each person differently. While one patient can have it really, really bad, where they are super fatigued, have the worst throat, and it lasts for up to 4 months, and then another patient can have more mild symptoms, while another person can have no symptoms at all and still be contagious. So just keeping that in mind. And it all depends on how compromised your immune system is, because this disease is very fast replicating, like I explained earlier. So if your immune system is compromised, it's going to take a very big toll on you. Next, for diagnosis. Usually when you are feeling all these things, the doctor can usually tell because of your symptoms and signs. And like once they look in your throat, it looks very apparent what mono little dots look like. But to confirm, they can do a monospot test, which they take a little drop of your blood from your fingertip, and then they look under a microscope to see if you have the heterophile antibody. And then that only works if you had never had mono before, but because if you had mono before and then it like resurfaced, you're always going to have the antibodies in your finger, so it won't really like, it can show false positives or false negatives. So if you had mono for the second time or the third time, they have to look in your blood. You have to do blood work and look through to see like if you have unusual white blood cells, fewer neutrophils or platelets, or they can also like detect new antibodies and old ones, and then they can tell you like if you have mono again or not. Next, for prevention and treatment. So unfortunately, there's no vaccination for mono. So you have to just protect yourself with other ways. Some prevention tips that I would give is do not kiss strangers, do not drink from water fountains, do not share drinks, utensils, and personal items with those who might be infected. Because I know it's called the kissing disease, but it's spread through saliva and you can get it with water fountains. So please do not drink out of a water fountain. It's just not good. When you have mono, some things that can help relieve your symptoms would be to drink fluids and stay hydrated and get plenty of rest, take over-the-counter medications for pain or fever like ibuprofen. Some careful advice is that your spleen may become enlarged, so that means that you need to avoid contact with sports and plane rides, because if you have a really high impact, your spleen can rupture, and that's a whole other big problem. It's important to know not to take antibiotics like amoxicillin, penicillin if you have mononucleosis, because it will make your infection worse. And this is speaking through experience. So I chose mono because a couple years ago I had mono and I got it through a teammate because I played club volleyball and we were all sharing water bottles, and I ended up getting the disease. But when I got it was Thanksgiving and nothing was open. So a doctor came to my house and like examined me, and he told me I had tonsillitis. So he gave me antibiotics to help with the pain and everything. But 2 days later, it was even worse. So I had to go to another doctor in a clinic, and they tested me and they were like, stop your antibiotics right now. It's making it worse. So yeah, don't take antibiotics if you have mono. Here are my resources, and thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I hope you guys have some questions.